then there is a declaration of his character in verse 19. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. The God who makes himself known, the God who is there, is fundamentally a God of sovereign grace. Paul, you may know, quotes this verse 19 in Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9 is that famous, and for some of us, infamous chapter where Paul is arguing about the rightness of election, that God would choose Jacob and not Esau, that God would choose those who would believe and be saved, and he would harden others. And in the midst of this argument, he says in verse 14 of Romans 9, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? Because that sounds like God's not being very fair. The answer, by no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And we may think, well, Paul, that's not a very good argument. We're dealing with a really difficult issue about election or predestination or reprobation, and you just go and you just quote from Exodus 33. It still seems like God is unjust. What Paul does is to answer this question about the injustice of God by reasserting what it means for God to be God. He says, no, that doesn't make God unfair. What it makes God is God. What it means is God is not you, and you're not God, but God is God. God's glory, God's goodness, the revelation of God's character are disclosed in that statement. Think about it. And we'll get another statement in chapter 34. There's a second one that's related, that also talks about God's loving kindness and grace. But here, when Moses wants to see his glory, and God says, you can't see it, but you'll get some of the afterburner of my glory. What does he do? He says two things, his name, and he makes a declaration of his sovereign grace. You want to know my glory? Let me tell you about my freedom and about my mercy. That's why these issues are important. That's why it's not simply reformed or one of the points of Calvinism, which some of us grew up with and love, and some of us seems very strange or maybe even offensive. But it confronts Moses, just as Paul will then pull it to confront his own readers with our human instincts, which are to make God more like us rather than to let God be God. God's sovereignty, his free decision to show undeserved mercy to whom he will show mercy, is not merely a reformed doctrine. It is not a minor point. It is essential in describing and defining what it means for God to be God. The freedom of God to dispense mercy to whomever he pleases, apart from any constraint outside of his own will, is the essence of what it means for God to be God. You notice it comes on the heels of declaring his name. This is what it means to be Yahweh. For God to be God, he must be merciful and he must be sovereign. And both teach us something indispensable about God, namely, he is gracious, and his grace is absolutely free grace.